He thought he had taken the wrong girl, but in less than an hour, she would become the one mistake he couldn't undo. The rain had started as a whisper, a thin silver curtain over the city streets, turning neon signs into blurred streaks of color across the pavement as Nia Brooks stepped out of the diner's back door, her apron folded under her arm and her sneakers damp from a 12-hour shift that paid barely enough to keep the lights on in her small apartment. She didn't notice the black SUV idling half a block away, didn't see the way its engine hummed low and patient like something waiting for the right moment, because her mind was somewhere else, on overdue rent, on her little brother's school supplies, on the quiet promise she had made to herself that no matter how hard things got, she would keep going. The street was nearly empty, just the distant sound of traffic and the soft drip of rain from metal fire escapes, and for a moment, everything felt still, almost peaceful, until it wasn't. The door of the SUV opened without urgency, just enough to break the rhythm of the night, and within seconds, the world shifted, not with chaos, not with noise, but with precision, like a plan unfolding exactly as intended, and when the door shut again, the street returned to silence as if nothing had happened at all. Miles away, in a warehouse washed in cold white light, Adrian Volkov stood with his hands resting lightly on the edge of a steel table, his presence filling the space without effort. His tailored coat dark against the pale glow above him, his expression unreadable as the woman was. Brought forward, not struggling, not pleading, just breathing steadily, her eyes adjusting to the brightness as she took in the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar faces, and finally, him. There was a pause, subtle but unmistakable, as Adrian studied her, his gaze sharp, calculating, searching for something that wasn't there, and in that pause, the air seemed to tighten, the kind of silence that didn't need words to carry weight. He straightened slightly, one hand brushing against the cuff of his sleeve, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, almost quiet, but it carried across the room like a verdict already decided. "This isn't her," he said, more to himself than anyone else, the words landing without drama, without anger, just certainty. The men around him shifted, exchanging glances that spoke of a mistake they weren't used to making, but Adrian didn't look at them, his attention fixed entirely on the woman standing in front of him, the one who should have been irrelevant, disposable, already on her way back to the life she came from. Instead, he stepped closer. Close enough to see the rain still clinging to the edges of her hair, to notice the steadiness in her posture, the way she didn't shrink under his gaze the way most people did, and something flickered, brief, almost imperceptible, before it disappeared behind the same controlled mask he wore like armor. "Wrong girl," he said again, softer this time, as if testing the words, and then, after a beat that stretched just long enough to matter, he added, "But you belong to me now," and the room went still, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they meant coming from him, because Adrian Volkov did not keep what he didn't need, did not make decisions without purpose, and yet here he was, rewriting the outcome of a mistake without explanation. Nia met his gaze then, really met it, her eyes steady, unflinching in a way that didn't fit the situation, and though her heart was racing somewhere beneath the surface, it didn't reach her voice, didn't break her composure as she held on to the one thing she refused to let go of, herself. The rain outside continued to fall, tapping softly against the high windows, and in that quiet rhythm, something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to mark the moment for what it was, the beginning of something neither of them had planned, and neither of them could walk away from. Adrian did not speak again immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any threat could have, stretching across the cold room as if time itself had slowed to watch what he would do next. The men around him shifted uneasily, waiting for an order that did not come, because this was not how he operated, not how he handled mistakes, and yet he remained still, his attention fixed entirely on Nia as though she had interrupted something deeper than a simple plan gone wrong. She stood where they had left her, rainwater still clinging to the edges of her sleeves, her breathing steady even though nothing about this situation made sense, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying a calm that did not match the circumstances. "I think you have made a mistake," she said, choosing her words carefully, not pleading, not challenging, just stating a fact the way she would to a customer who had been given the wrong order. One of the men let out a short breath as if expecting that to be the wrong move, but Adrian did not react the way they anticipated, did not dismiss her or cut her off. Instead he tilted his head slightly, studying her in a way that felt less like judgment and more like curiosity, and that alone shifted the energy in the room. "I already said that," he replied, his tone even, controlled, as if the conversation was unfolding exactly as he intended, even though it was not. "The question is what to do about it," and the way he said it made it clear that the answer had already been decided, whether anyone else understood it or not. Nia's fingers tightened slightly around the folded fabric she still held, a small, almost invisible movement, but her eyes did not waver, did not drop to the floor the way most people's would under his gaze, and that defiance, quiet and unspoken, settled into the space between them like a line that neither of them had crossed yet. "You let me go," she said simply, as if it were the most reasonable solution, as if he were just another man and not someone who controlled entire rooms without raising his voice, and for a brief second, something in Adrian's expression shifted again, not anger, not amusement, but something harder to define, like recognition of a pattern he had not expected to see. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing until the tension became almost tangible, and though his presence was overwhelming, there was no rush in his movement, no urgency, just quiet certainty. "If it were that simple, you would already be gone," he answered, his voice low, not threatening, just final, and behind him, one of the men glanced at the others as if trying to understand why this conversation was still happening at all. Nia exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the only thing she could control, her own composure, because fear would not help her here, panic would not change anything. And she had learned long ago that sometimes the only power you had was how you chose to stand in the middle of something you did not ask for. "Then you chose the wrong problem," she said, the words steady, deliberate, landing between them without hesitation, and this time, the reaction was unmistakable, not from the men in the room, but from Adrian himself, a pause that lasted just long enough to matter, just long enough to reveal that she had said something no one else ever did. The air seemed to shift again, quieter now, heavier, as if the rules had changed without anyone announcing it, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a moment longer before he straightened, turning slightly as if the decision had settled into place. "Get her something dry," he said finally, not looking away from her even as he gave the order, "and clear the west room," and the words sent a ripple through the room because they were not what anyone expected, not for a mistake, not for someone who should have already been on her way out of his world. Nia did not move right away, did not thank him, did not question him, she simply stood there, watching. Measuring, the way she had learned to do when life shifted without warning, and somewhere beneath the controlled calm of Adrian Volkov, something unfamiliar had begun to take shape, something he did not name, something he did not fully understand, but something that had already changed the direction of everything that came next. The west room was warmer, quieter, a sharp contrast to the cold precision of the warehouse floor, with soft lighting that reflected off polished wood and muted gray walls, the kind of space designed for control without intimidation, and yet the tension followed Nia inside like a shadow that refused to stay behind. The door closed with a soft click, not locked, not forced, just final enough to remind her that she was not free to leave, and for a moment, she stood there, taking in every detail the way she always did when stepping into unfamiliar territory, noting the distance to the window, the placement of the chair, the absence of anything unnecessary, because details mattered when nothing else made sense. A woman entered shortly after, carrying folded clothes and a towel, her expression neutral, professional, as if this were routine, as if bringing dry clothes to someone who had been taken from the street in the middle of the night was just another task on a long list of responsibilities, and she placed them carefully on the chair without meeting Nia's eyes for too long. "You should change," she said quietly, her tone respectful but distant, and then she stepped back, leaving space, leaving silence. Nia hesitated only for a second before moving, not because she trusted the situation, but because she understood that resisting every small thing would not give her control, it would only waste energy she might need later, and as she changed into the dry clothes, she felt the weight of everything settle in, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that sharpened her thoughts instead of clouding them, because panic had never helped her before and it was not going to help her now. When she stepped back into the room, the woman had already left, the door still closed, the quiet pressing in again, and Nia exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the only constant she had ever known, her ability to endure, to think, to stay steady when everything else shifted. Across the hall, Adrian stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, his presence filling the room without effort, his coat removed now, his sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the controlled precision in every movement, and when his eyes met hers again, there was something different there, not softer, not warmer, but more focused, as if he had decided that she was no longer just a mistake to be corrected, but something to be understood. You are not asking questions, he observed, his voice calm, almost curious, and it was not an accusation, just a statement that carried weight. Because it meant he had been expecting something else, something more predictable. Nia leaned slightly against the edge of the table, not in defiance, not in submission, just in balance, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am, she replied, her tone even, I just do not think you would answer them yet, and the honesty in that answer hung in the air, unpolished, unguarded, and for a brief moment, Adrian's expression shifted again, that same flicker of something unspoken passing through his eyes before it disappeared beneath control. He stepped further into the room, closing the distance with measured calm, not crowding her, not backing away, just placing himself within the space as if testing the boundaries she had already begun to redraw without permission. You think you understand how this works, he said, not dismissive, not impressed, just stating another observation, and Nia tilted her head slightly, considering his words before answering. No, she said, but I understand people, and right now, you are deciding whether I matter, and that landed differently, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, steady, certain, as if she had already accepted the possibility of either outcome. The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but full of something shifting beneath the surface. And Adrian held her gaze a second longer than necessary before turning slightly, his attention moving toward the window as if the city beyond it held answers he had not yet chosen to face, because this was not part of the plan, this was not how control was supposed to feel, and yet here he was, standing in a room with someone who refused to be reduced to a mistake, someone who did not fit into any category he had ever relied on, and for the first time in a long time, the certainty he carried so easily felt just a little less absolute. The silence did not break all at once, it thinned, like fog lifting slowly from a city that never truly slept, and Adrian remained by the window, his reflection faint against the glass as the rain outside traced slow, uneven lines down the surface, each drop catching light before disappearing into the dark. Behind him, Nia did not move, not because she felt trapped, but because she understood that movement, right now, would not change the outcome, only observation would, and she had learned early in life that the difference between surviving and losing everything often came down to how well you could read a room when no one was speaking. Adrian turned back toward her, his expression composed, but there was a shift in the way his gaze settled, less distant, more deliberate, as if he had reached a conclusion he was not ready to explain, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority, but with something else beneath it, something quieter, harder to name. You said I am deciding whether you matter, he repeated, stepping closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the air between them feel charged with something neither of them acknowledged. What makes you think that decision is yours to influence? And it was not a challenge, not exactly, more like a question asked by someone who was not used to being questioned in return. Nia let the words settle before answering, her posture steady, her eyes level, not defiant, not submissive, just present in a way that refused to disappear. Because people like you do not keep things that have no value, she said, her tone measured, thoughtful, as if she were piecing the logic together out loud. And I am still here. And that answer landed with a quiet precision that echoed through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its simplicity. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of the truth embedded in her words, and for a moment, the roles between them blurred, not reversed, but adjusted, as if the balance had shifted just enough to be noticed. He moved past her then, his steps controlled, his attention briefly scanning the room as though he were recalibrating something internal, something that had been disturbed by a variable he had not accounted for, and when he stopped, it was not far from her, close enough that the quiet between them felt intentional rather than accidental. You assume I need a reason, he said, his voice lower. Now, more contained, and Nia turned slightly to face him fully, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharpened, because this was not just a statement, it was a test, one that did not come with clear rules. Everyone does, she replied, without hesitation, and the certainty in her voice carried the weight of lived experience rather than theory. Even if they pretend they do not, and that was the moment something shifted again. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that Adrian did not respond right away, enough that the silence stretched just a fraction longer than before. Outside, a distant roll of thunder moved across the sky, low and steady, blending into the rhythm of the rain, and inside the room, the tension settled into something quieter, more complex, as if the edges of the situation had softened without losing their shape. Adrian exhaled slowly, the movement subtle, controlled, and when he spoke again, it was not to challenge her, not to dismiss her, but to redefine the space they were standing in. Then you will have to prove it, he said, and though the words were simple, they carried implication, expectation, a shift from passive observation to active involvement, and Nia understood that immediately, not as an opportunity, not as a threat, but as a change in the rules she had not agreed to but now had to navigate. She held his gaze for a moment longer, steady, unflinching, before nodding once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because whether she wanted to or not, the situation had already moved beyond what it was supposed to be, beyond a mistake, beyond a simple correction, into something neither of them had planned, and somewhere in that quiet, unspoken space between control and resistance, a new kind of tension began to take shape, one that would not be resolved quickly, one that would not follow the rules either of them were used to, and for the first time since the night began, the outcome no longer felt predetermined. The room did not feel like a place meant for negotiation, but that was exactly what it had become, not through raised voices or visible tension, but through the quiet exchange of control that neither of them acknowledged out loud. And as Adrian's words settled into the air, Nia understood that whatever came next would not be given freely, it would be measured, observed, and tested in ways she could not fully predict. She shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, her fingers brushing the edge of the table as she considered what "prove it" actually meant in a world where the rules were written by someone else, and for a brief moment, her mind flickered back to the life she had left just hours ago, the hum of the diner, the clatter of plates, the predictable rhythm of long shifts and small tips, a life where everything was difficult but at least understandable, and the contrast hit her not as fear, but as clarity, because here, nothing was familiar, and that meant she had to rely on the one thing that had always carried her through uncertainty, her ability to read people when they thought they were unreadable. Adrian watched her closely, not impatient, not pressing, just observing. As if her response was already part of a calculation he had begun the moment she walked into his world, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. "You want a reason to keep me," she said, not as a question, but as an interpretation, and his gaze sharpened slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition that she was following the pattern faster than expected. "I want to see if you are worth the complication," he replied, his tone even, but the words carried weight, because complication was not something he tolerated lightly, not in his work, not in his life, and certainly not in situations that began as mistakes. Nia absorbed that, not reacting immediately, letting the meaning settle, because worth, in his world, was not measured the same way it was in hers, and proving it would require more than words, more than defiance. It would require something she had not yet revealed, something she was not even sure he was looking for. The door opened quietly then, and one of his men stepped in, his posture respectful but urgent, pausing just inside the threshold as if aware that he was interrupting something he did not fully understand. "There is a situation," he said, carefully, choosing his words with precision, and Adrian did not turn right away, his attention still on Nia, as if weighing whether to break the moment or let it continue, but the slight shift in his expression made the decision for him. He stepped away, his focus snapping back into place with practiced ease. "Handle it," he said at first, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually ended conversations before they began, but the man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, enough to signal that this was not routine, and Adrian noticed. Of course he did, his gaze narrowing slightly as he finally turned. "What kind of situation?" he asked, and the answer came low, controlled, but unmistakable. "The people who were supposed to take the other girl. They are looking for her, and they know something went wrong," and the room seemed to tighten again, not with panic, but with the kind of awareness that came when a mistake began to ripple outward. Adrian's jaw set, the calm surface of his control still intact, but something beneath it shifted, something sharper, more focused, and when he glanced back at Nia, the weight of the situation settled differently, not as an abstract complication, but as something immediate, something real. because she was no longer just a variable in his decision, she was now connected to a problem that was already moving beyond his walls. Nia met his gaze, understanding enough from the exchange to know that whatever had happened to bring her here was not over, not contained, and for the first time since the night began, the stakes felt larger than just her own situation, larger than just his decision, because now there were other people involved, other intentions at play, and whether she wanted to or not, she was already part of it. Adrian exhaled slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, before giving his next order, his voice steady, decisive. "No one leaves," he said, and though the words were directed at the room, his eyes remained on her, as if acknowledging something neither of them had planned for, something that had already begun to change the direction of everything that followed. The words lingered in the air long after Adrian spoke them, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that settled over the room like a quiet command no one would dare question, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath, as if even the building itself understood that something had shifted beyond routine control. Nia felt it too, not as fear, but as a tightening awareness that the situation had moved into something more complex, something that now extended beyond the walls around them, and she straightened slightly. Her mind already adjusting, already calculating what it meant to be caught between two sides of a mistake she had never chosen. Adrian remained still for a second longer, his gaze fixed on her as if confirming a decision he had not yet voiced, and then he turned, his focus snapping outward, back into the world that he controlled with precision and expectation. "Increase security on all entries," he said, his voice calm but sharpened by intent, "and find out how much they know," and the man who had delivered the message nodded quickly before stepping out, the door closing behind him with that same quiet finality. The room settled again, but the silence felt different now, heavier, more deliberate, as if every second carried weight, and Adrian moved back toward her, slower this time, not with urgency, but with purpose, his presence filling the space without effort as he stopped just a few feet away, close enough that there was no mistaking the fact that she was no longer just an observer in his world, she was part of the equation. "This changes things," he said, not as an explanation, but as a statement of fact, and Nia met his gaze without hesitation, because she already understood that much, already felt the shift in the air. "It was never just a mistake," she replied quietly, and the certainty in her voice made him pause, just slightly, just enough to register that she was not reacting. She was thinking. Adrian studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, but there was something new in the way his attention settled on her, something more focused, more deliberate, as if he was no longer measuring her against the situation, but measuring the situation against her, and that shift carried implications neither of them spoke out loud. "You are involved now," he said finally, his tone even, controlled, but the words carried weight, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a reality that had already taken shape, and Nia exhaled slowly, absorbing that, not resisting it, not accepting it blindly, just acknowledging the truth of it, because denial would not change anything, and she had never been someone who wasted time pretending a problem did not exist. "Then tell me what they wanted," she said, her voice steady, direct, and for a moment, Adrian did not respond, not because he could not, but because the question itself was unexpected, not in its content, but in its intent, because most people in her position would ask how to get out, how to leave, how to survive, but she was asking about the situation, about the people outside, about the reason behind it all. That alone shifted something again, subtle but undeniable, and Adrian took a step closer, his gaze narrowing slightly as if reassessing a calculation that had already begun to change. "They were not looking for you," he said, his voice low, controlled, "but now they will be," and the implication settled between them, quiet and unavoidable, because it meant that her presence here was no longer temporary, no longer something that could be undone with a simple decision. It was now part of a larger movement, something that had already begun beyond either of their control. Nia held his gaze, her expression calm, but her mind moving quickly, piecing together what little she knew with what he had just revealed, and for the first time, the situation began to take shape in a way that made sense, not safe, not simple, but clear enough to understand the direction it was heading, and she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because whether she wanted to or not, she was already inside it. Adrian watched her for a second longer, the silence stretching just enough to carry meaning, before he turned slightly, his attention shifting back toward the door, toward the world outside that was already moving closer, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority, but with a new layer beneath it, something more personal, more deliberate. "Stay close," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that neither of them ignored, because in that moment, it was no longer about control, no longer about a mistake, it was about something else entirely, something that had already begun to bind their paths together in ways neither of them had planned. The hallway outside the room felt different now, not louder, not more chaotic, but sharper, as if every movement carried intention and every quiet step meant something more than it had just minutes before, and when Adrian moved, Nia followed without being told again, not because she trusted him, but because she understood the unspoken rule that had already taken hold, that staying close was no longer a suggestion. It was the only position that made sense. The lights overhead cast long, clean shadows across the polished floor, and as they walked, the subtle shift in attention from the people they passed did not go unnoticed, eyes lowering, shoulders straightening, the kind of reaction that came from recognition of authority rather than fear alone, and Nia took it all in without turning her head, without breaking stride, because she had learned how to observe without drawing attention, how to exist in a space without announcing her presence. Adrian stopped near a large table where several screens displayed quiet streams of information, nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just numbers, locations, patterns that meant everything to the people trained to read them, and he rested one hand lightly against the surface, his posture relaxed but precise, as if control did not require effort, only awareness. "They are tracing the mistake," he said, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate space, but clear enough that Nia understood every word, and she stepped closer, not too close, just enough to see the screens without asking permission, her eyes moving quickly, not because she recognized the details, but because she recognized the structure, the way information was layered, filtered, prioritized. "They think she is here," she said quietly, not as a guess, but as a conclusion drawn from the pattern she could already see, and Adrian glanced at her, that same flicker of recognition passing through his expression again, brief but undeniable. "They think someone interfered," he corrected, his tone even, and Nia nodded slightly, adjusting her understanding without hesitation, because the difference mattered. It meant they were not just searching, they were analyzing, and that made them more dangerous in ways that did not need to be explained. The room remained calm, controlled, but beneath that surface, there was movement, quiet communication, subtle shifts in attention that signaled preparation rather than reaction, and Adrian straightened slightly, his focus narrowing as he studied the data in front of him, but his awareness did not leave her, not entirely. As if part of him was still measuring her presence against everything else unfolding around them. "You see patterns quickly," he said after a moment, not looking at her directly, but the statement was meant for her, and Nia did not hesitate. "I had to," she replied simply, her voice steady, because in her world, missing a pattern meant missing a bill, missing a shift, missing a chance to keep things together, and there had never been room for that. Adrian turned then, his gaze settling on her fully, more direct than before, more deliberate, as if something had clicked into place that he had not been expecting to find. "Then you will stay with me," he said, not as an order, not entirely, but as a decision already made, and the words carried a different weight now, not just control, not just necessity, but something closer to recognition of value, even if it was not named as such. Nia held his gaze, absorbing that, understanding the shift without reacting to it outwardly, because this was not safety, this was not freedom, but it was something that changed her position from a passive part of the mistake to an active piece of whatever came next, and she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the role that had been placed in front of her. The screens continued to glow softly, the quiet hum of the room steady and controlled, but outside, beyond the walls, something was already moving closer, something that had not yet reached them but would, and Adrian knew it. Nia could see it in the way his focus sharpened, in the way his stillness became more deliberate, and in that shared awareness, unspoken but clear, the distance between them shifted again, not erased, not softened, but redefined, because whatever was coming next, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of it, they were standing in the same direction, watching it approach. The hum of the room did not change, but the meaning behind it did, every flicker of light from the screens now carrying urgency that had not been there before, and Adrian remained still for a moment longer, studying the incoming data as if the patterns themselves would reveal intent if he looked long enough, while Nia stood beside him, her attention moving across the same streams of information, not with the same familiarity, but with the same focus, because patterns did not require permission to be understood, only the willingness to see them clearly. One of the screens shifted, a subtle change in positioning data that caused a ripple of quiet movement among the men nearby, not panic, not alarm, just a recalibration that spoke of something approaching closer than expected, and Adrian's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening just enough to signal awareness. "They are narrowing it down," he said, his voice low, controlled, but the weight behind it unmistakable. And Nia leaned slightly forward, her eyes tracking the change, recognizing the shift in direction even without knowing the full system behind it. "They are not just searching," she said quietly, her tone thoughtful, "they are predicting," and Adrian glanced at her again, that now familiar flicker crossing his expression, not surprise anymore, but confirmation, as if each observation she made reinforced something he had already begun to suspect. The air in the room felt denser now, not heavier with fear, but tighter with focus, as if every person present had aligned toward the same invisible point beyond the walls, and Adrian moved then, stepping away from the table with measured calm, his decisions forming without hesitation. "We do not wait for them to arrive," he said, not raising his voice, but the command carried instantly, drawing quiet responses from the men around him who moved into position without question. Nia turned slightly to follow him, her steps matching his pace, not trailing behind, not stepping ahead, just staying within that unspoken distance that had formed between them. And as they moved through the corridor, the environment shifted again, doors opening, voices low but coordinated, a system activating rather than reacting, and she understood then that whatever was coming was not new to him, but the variable she represented was, and that made everything less predictable. Adrian stopped near a secondary control point, smaller, more contained, and he placed one hand against the edge of the console, his gaze moving between two screens that displayed overlapping movement patterns, his focus absolute, but his awareness still split, still tracking her presence as if it had become part of the calculation rather than a distraction. "If they confirm this location, they will not hesitate," he said, not looking at her, but the words were meant for her, and Nia absorbed them without reaction, because hesitation was not something she expected from people like that, not from people who moved with purpose. "Then they are already committed," she replied, her voice steady, and Adrian nodded once, a small, precise acknowledgement that carried more meaning than agreement, because it meant she was not just following the situation, she was anticipating it. A brief pause settled between them, not empty, but filled with the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not allow for second guesses, and Adrian turned slightly toward her, his expression more focused than before, more direct. "Stay where I can see you," he said, the words simple, but the tone different now, not just control, not just strategy, but something closer to intent, as if her position mattered in a way that extended beyond the immediate situation. Nia met his gaze, holding it for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, not yielding, just acknowledging the shift, because she could feel it too, the way the space between them had changed, the way she was no longer standing at the edge of his world, but somewhere inside it, and she nodded once, her response calm, deliberate, because whether she understood all the reasons or not, she understood the reality, that the moment had moved beyond choice, beyond mistake, into something that required both of them to stand exactly where they were. The lights above flickered slightly as another update came through, subtle but enough to draw Adrian's attention back to the screens, and his gaze sharpened, locking onto the new data with precision, because whatever had been approaching was now closer, clearer, and in that quiet, controlled space filled with movement and stillness at the same time, the distance between anticipation and arrival had almost disappeared. The update did not come with noise or urgency, it arrived as a quiet shift across the screen, a set of coordinates tightening into focus, and Adrian saw it instantly, the way a man trained by years of precision recognizes the exact moment when uncertainty becomes fact. The room did not react outwardly, but the energy changed, sharper now, more defined, as if every person present understood that whatever had been approaching was no longer theoretical, it was here, just beyond the edges of their control, and Adrian's gaze remained fixed on the data for a second longer before he exhaled slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, the kind that marked a decision already made, they have confirmed the location, he said, his voice calm, but the weight behind it unmistakable, and no one needed further explanation, because the implication was clear, the line between outside and inside had been crossed. Nia stood beside him, her attention following the same shift, her understanding not based on familiarity with his world, but on instinct sharpened by years of navigating uncertainty, and she felt it too, that moment when everything stops being a possibility and becomes something real, something that cannot be undone, and she did not look away, did not step back, because there was nowhere to go. That would take her out of this now. Adrian turned slightly toward her, his expression more focused than it had been at any point before, not colder, not harsher, but clearer, as if the situation had stripped away anything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room faded, the movement, the screens, the quiet coordination, all of it receding behind the space between them. "You should not be here," he said, the words simple, but carrying something that had not been there before, not just control, not just strategy, but something closer to acknowledgement of the risk she represented, and the risk she carried, and Nia met his gaze without hesitation, because she had already understood that, already accepted it in the moment she chose not to break under the weight of everything that had happened. "But I am," she replied, her voice steady, not defiant, not resigned, just certain, and that certainty settled into the space between them in a way that words rarely did, because it was not about argument, it was about truth. Adrian held her gaze for a second longer, and in that second, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but changes everything that follows, and then he looked away, not in dismissal, but in decision, because hesitation was not something he allowed himself, not in moments like this. "Then you stay with me," he said, the words firm, final, but different now, not just an order, not just control, but a choice, one that carried weight beyond the immediate situation, and Nia nodded once, not because she had been told, but because she understood what that meant, that her place in this had been defined, not as a mistake, not as something to be corrected, but as something to be kept. The room around them moved with quiet precision, preparations aligning, positions set. But the moment between them lingered, just beneath the surface of everything else, because in the middle of a situation that should have been simple, a mistake that should have been corrected, something else had taken root, something neither of them had planned, something neither of them fully understood yet. Adrian stepped forward then, his focus returning outward, his presence once again filling the space with the kind of control that did not need to be asserted, and Nia moved with him, not behind, not ahead, but beside, the distance between them no longer accidental, no longer temporary, but chosen. And as the final pieces of information settled into place and the reality of what was coming became undeniable, there was no panic, no chaos, only a quiet, steady awareness that whatever happened next would not separate their paths, it would bind them further, and in that moment, without needing to say it, without needing to define it, the truth became clear: she was never just the wrong girl, and he was never going to let her go.